What's up everyone, and thank you for stopping by the channel. Today's project is this Ryobi string trimmer, and the problem is that it starts, but it doesn't run very well. Let's take a good look at it, find out what's wrong with it, and hopefully we can fix it. In this video, we try and repair this trimmer. However, it may not be the exact repair you need to make to yours. We'll explore other options later in the video. Now, Ryobi lawn equipment are not known as quality machines, but there are those out there who have them and have had very little problems with them. And by the looks of this one, it seems to have been taken care of for the last decade and a half. But if you use the wrong gas and store it poorly, then it doesn't matter how much you paid for your equipment, it's going to develop problems. It's pretty obvious that someone has replaced the primer bulb and fuel lines at some point, but the lines have started to leak, which means they're beginning to harden and shrink, so they need to be replaced. But before we do that, I want to start the trimmer and show you what it does and doesn't do. As you just saw, it started and ran, but after getting it into the run position, it wouldn't rev up when squeezing the trigger. This tells me that the carburetor isn't getting enough fuel to the engine, but before we try adjusting the carburetor, let's try looking at the fuel in the tank first. So the fuel has a lot of oil in it, and believe it or not, this wouldn't necessarily cause a running problem. This would cause a smoking problem out of the muffler and possibly a clogged spark arrestor screen, but I want to start with the carburetor first and see if there are any issues there. Before you take the fuel lines off the carburetor, just remove the filter line first and then press the primer bulb several times. This will push any remaining fuel out of the carburetor through the return line and leave you with less mess when you take the carburetor apart. First part I want to remove is the primer bulb section. That way we can inspect the pumping diaphragm, and what we're looking for is that these two check valve flaps are flat and parallel with the rest of the diaphragm. The easiest way is to look at them from the side, and this one looks to be good, so we're going to reuse it. If yours isn't parallel and bent away from the rest of the diaphragm, then you might want to consider a rebuild kit or a new carburetor. The next thing we need to inspect is the inlet screen for dirt or debris, and as you can see, there's not much there, but we could use a bit of cleaning. We won't do that until we remove the metering diaphragm to inspect it and remove the needle and rocker arm on the other side of the carburetor though. So the metering diaphragm has begun to harden up a bit. It's supposed to be flexible so it can control fuel flow through the carburetor. Also, it's a bit misshapen as it's not supposed to have wrinkles in it, and that means we need to remove and replace it. Next, take out the needle and rocker arm assembly. Just be very careful as these parts are very small. If you lose any one of these parts, you might as well order a new carburetor. Next, spray some carb cleaner on the screen to remove whatever might be on it. The other thing you need to do is check that fuel will flow through the screen. If it doesn't, then you'll need to remove the screen and soak it in carb cleaner to remove any varnished fuel that might be clogging it. Once you confirm that fuel will flow through the screen, we'll start putting the carburetor back together. So this is the new metering diaphragm, and as you can see, it's very flexible, and I do realize it looks a little different from the original one. But the most important part is that the length of the stem in the middle should match the original one, and also if there are any extra air passages through it, which in this case there are none. After that, I'll remove and replace the primer bulb. Before you swap them out, just make sure that they're both the same size. They usually come in two different sizes, and this is the larger one. The next step is to remove the old fuel lines and replace them. I do have a feeling that someone must have enlarged these holes as the lines are very easy to slide out of them, so I'll have to use a slightly larger fuel line. You won't have to do this part though. So here's the old fuel filter, and I think I can reuse it if I can clean it. I'll just spray some carb cleaner through the old fuel line a couple times, and that should do the trick. So here's the fuel line I'll be using. It's Tygon line, which is supposed to be more ethanol resistant than normal clear line. The line you'll need will be 3/16 of an inch, and to help get it into the tank, cut the end at a sharp angle. The first line I'll be running will be the fuel filter line. You might have to use some bent pliers to help get the line out of the tank. That way you can cut the angle piece off and install the fuel filter. Then cut the other end of the fuel line to about the location where the carburetor will be. After that, you can run the return line. When pushing the return line into the tank, I usually push about ½ an inch to 1 inch into the tank, but you can choose to put more in the tank if you want to. So the fuel filter line will connect to the carburetor's lower brass port, and that means the return line will connect to the upper brass port. We can then reconnect the throttle linkage and replace the base for the rotary choke. Then I'll put some fuel into the tank and test the priming system. If your primer bulb does not fill up with fuel, the engine most likely will not start. If that happens, you can inspect the carburetor again, but for me, I usually just order a new one. So when pressing the primer bulb, fuel should come from the tank through the filter line and fill up the primer bulb, and then go back to the tank through the return line. And as you can see, it did exactly that. If your fuel comes to the return line first, stop pressing the primer bulb and swap your lines at the ports, and then try pressing it again. Now before we try and start the engine, I want to check the spark plug to see if it's fouled with carbon from the fuel with too much oil in it. Now it's not that bad, but I still want to replace it anyway. Now before we start the engine, I also want to replace the trimmer line, but it seems to be kind of stuck. That means we'll have to remove the trimmer head, take it apart, and see why the line won't come out, and hopefully we can fix it, otherwise we'll need to replace it. So it looks like one of these spring-loaded sliders is stuck, so I'll spray some carb cleaner on them, and after letting it dry off, I'll spray some lithium grease on them and make sure that they move freely. After that, I'll remove the last bit of line, reassemble the trimmer head, and install it back onto the trimmer. I'll then put some line in it, and the reason is I need some sort of load on the engine just in case I need to tune the carburetor. Another reason why this trimmer might not be revving up when you squeeze the trigger is that the spark arrestor screen is clogged with carbon, and even though the fuel was extra heavy in oil, I did check it off camera and it wasn't clogged. If yours was clogged, however, you can burn off the carbon and reuse the screen. Now this particular carburetor requires a Pac-Man style adjusting tool, but yours might be different. These can be bought online as a kit of several different types for less than $20. It's difficult to show you, but the screw closer to the engine is the L screw, and that's for low engine speed fuel adjustment, while the screw closer to the air filter is the H screw, and that's for high engine speed fuel adjustment. So after getting it started, it seemed to run fine. However, I wanted to see how far off it was from max engine speed, and surprisingly, it wasn't too far off. I turned the H screw clockwise to see if it would increase the engine speed, which it did. I then found where the engine speed was at its max, and then turned the H screw counterclockwise till the engine speed dropped off a bit. This will keep the engine from getting too hot and burning up. In the end, the H screw only ended up about a quarter turn away from where it initially started. So my question is, would you ever use this particular Ryobi trimmer if it was given to you to use for as long as you wanted? Personally, I don't mind using it. It has a lot of power, however, it's a bit heavier than the Weed Eater brand trimmer I normally use, so I think I'd have to use a shoulder strap. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions, and I hope to see you in the next video.